Good morning, friends. I wanted to provide an opportunity for all of you to do the text analysis of the topic background essay, either before class or during class, or as you have the opportunity. So, once more, going to our classroom website, if you click on Road to Revolution, this will provide you the link to the text of our history lab. And please remember that our goal is to have the topic background essay read and ready to be discussed this week. So, what I've prepared for you is a little broken up slideshow that will assist you as we kind of get rolling. So, the Road to Revolution, this is our lab analysis. So I've copied chunks of the topic background essay. That way we can talk about them as we're reading. Often lost in discussions of America's bid for independence is the fact that colonists never set out to be revolutionaries. The early 18th century brought decades of economic growth and increasing self-reliance to American shores. However, this came to a crashing halt when the British government imposed higher taxes and restraints on colonists after the conclusion of the French and Indian War, leading formerly loyal subjects to turn on their king. The French and Indian War, a battle between Britain and France for supremacy in North America, was the first step on the colonists' road to revolution. The territory that started it all was the land in the Ohio Valley. Britain laid claim to all the land from North Carolina to Nova Scotia and to the west indefinitely. The Ohio Valley, they reasoned, fell within the borders of the Virginia colony. The French claimed that the land was theirs, owing to early explorers and fur traders. The territory had a third claim, the Iroquois, who were there long before either the French or British explorers discovered the American continent. By 1753, the dispute over the Ohio Valley was a powder keg waiting to explode. While the French fought to hold the territory, the British prepared to rout them out for the last time by calling on American colonists to take up arms for king and country. So the phrase from the earlier, or from that paragraph that I want you to call attention to, is the one that says the territory that started it all was the land in the Ohio Valley. Britain laid claim to all of the land from North Carolina to Nova Scotia. To the west indefinitely, the Ohio Valley, they reasoned, fell within the borders of the Virginia colony. So Virginia is here. Virginia is here. And the British decided that from this line north all the way up to Nova Scotia, so this portion was all British territory. That is not a fair statement because you also have the province of Quebec. You've got the Quebecers, the French people are also laying claim, and we have the Indian people, like your native populations that inhabited the area. So you have three separate groups that are all claiming this one area, this one access point as theirs. Important to realize why this territory, this kind of landlocked location matters. If you'll notice, we have this body of water that you can access and access other rivers and tributaries. So, in a time before airplanes, in a time before railroads, in a time before highways, trade and movement was heavily dependent upon access to water and ports. So, that's why this territory was so crucial. Considering themselves loyal subjects willing to fight for the glory of England, colonists went to battle over the leadership of British officers. Among them were George Washington and William Pitt. Historian Fred Anderson describes George Washington during this period as a soldier of the British Empire, seeking to extend the authority of his king into the heart of the continent. Did you catch that? Our very first president of our new nation was once a British soldier. However, in order to win, the colonies would need to cooperate with one another on a level never before done. Ben Franklin graphically depicted the need for the 13 colonies to unify in his famous 1754 cartoon, Join or Die, showing that together they could survive. However, if even one piece should separate, the entire entity would perish. This unification allowed the Anglo American colonists to not only defeat the French in 1760, but it also allowed colonists to see that together, these 13 individual parts could be very strong indeed. Britain's treaty with France gave control of North America from the Atlantic to the eastern shore of the Mississippi River, including Canada and Florida, to the British. Let's talk about this Join or Die depiction cartoon. So this image you've seen before, it's in our packet, and now it's here. And it's a chopped up snake. And you've got the New England colonies, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And what Ben Franklin intended with this cartoon is showing that if you hack up the colonies and you become segmented, the strength that was the serpent goes away. So you either have to stick together to survive, or if you fracture, you are going to die and fall apart. So, finding solutions. The party left out of these negotiations were the Native Americans of the Ohio Valley. Colonists believed the land was their battle prize, formed settlements in the valley. The British, in turn, built forts to protect them. In response, Native Americans rose up in insurrection, leading once again to war. Eventually, the insurrection was quelled. The king recognized that peace with the Indians was only temporary. He issued the Proclamation of 1763, which formally prohibited white settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains and ordered those already settled in this territory to forthwith remove themselves. This did not sit well with the colonists. Some thought that the removal was a strategic maneuver by the king to keep the colonists under control by hemming them in on the East Coast. Others resented having the land taken away that they had that they had really won in a battlefield. So just to show you one more time, this red line that you see is the Proclamation line of 1763. And when this line was established, the King of England made all colonists move to this side of that line. There's a natural barrier here, your Appalachian Mountains, and aspects of different river systems too. So there we are. So there is a price for peace. As peace settled in on the American colonies, questions grew as to who would pay for what ended up being a very expensive war. The cost for the war against the Indians and the French was staggering, and by 1763 the war had doubled the British national debt to nearly 150 million pounds and brought the country to the brink of bankruptcy. However, the spending did not stop with the war's end. British troops were left in the colonies as a security measure against further Indian and French aggression. However, where the Crown saw these troops as securing the countryside against possible outside attacks, colonists saw it as an unnecessary military occupation. Moreover, a growing national debt meant only one thing to those in power in London. They would have to raise taxes to pay for the war, and the colonists would have to bear the burden. So, in thinking about what is going on here, the role of a government is to protect its people. The British left British troops in the colonies to maintain safety and security for the colonists. The colonists did not have their own military force. They relied on the protection from the king through the soldiers to maintain their safety. They did not have an organized military presence. So let's pause for a second. I want you to really be clear on the role of the mother country, which in our case is England, and the role of the colony. The colony's sole purpose is to support the mother country, and the mother country's sole purpose is to provide safety and security for the colonies. This is a idea called mercantilism, and it really became popular during the European Age of Exploration. Many nations in Europe, especially England, adopted this new economic policy. The theory of mercantilism says that a country's power depended mainly upon its wealth. Wealth, after all, allowed nations to build strong navies and purchase vital goods. As a result, the goal of every nation became the attainment of as much wealth as possible. And a nation's ultimate goal under mercantilism was to become self sufficient, not dependent on other countries for goods. So, a mother country maintains the treasury. So, all funding, all money that is needed for military action, all money that is needed for infrastructure, all costs related to running the business end of a country requires funds. How do you get that? Well, a mother country is typically going to be more industrialized than the colonies. Colonies are going to be less industrialized, but they will have all of the access to natural resources. We talked about this in our last unit. So the colonies would harvest the crops, they would harvest the trees, they would, catch all of the beavers, and they would create the leather, they would do these things. They would take all of those natural resources and ship them to England. England, being industrialized, would parse out into the different businesses within England all of those items. The lumber would go to the shipyard. The fur would go to the hat makers, and the tobacco. That probably just stayed in the South. But if you think about like cotton, raw cotton would be collected and then sent to England to be transformed into textiles. Those finished goods that had been manufactured would then be offered back to the colonies for purchase. That way, this cycle could continue, and it develops this really strong relationship. Back to the essay. To the British, these taxes seemed fair. After all, the average Briton paid 26 shillings a year in taxes in 1763, while the average colonist in Massachusetts only paid 1. The first of these taxes, the Sugar Act of 1764, was actually a continuation of an earlier act on sugar products. It was also a tax that merchants regularly evaded. The new law reduced the tax rate on sugar products, but raised the rate on others, including some not taxed under the earlier 1733 levies, and restricted other products altogether. Other prohibitive legislation followed in quick succession. The Stamp Act of 1765 taxed the paper for formal and legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, even dice. The Quartering Act of 1765 forced citizens to provide room and board for the British troops occupying the colonies. And if you think about that, it's probably okay. Maybe. We'll have a big class discussion. The Townshend Act, 1767, which taxed glass, lead, paint colors, and paper imported into the colonies. And while this tax wasn't expected to raise much in the way of revenue, Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend knew that once the law was in place, he could expand this program. Not only did colonists worry that these taxes were setting a dangerous precedent, they also could not have come at a worse time. The colonies were in the midst of an economic depression, particularly in the Northeast. A succession of devastating fires burned down Boston, first in 1760, then again in 1761, leveling huge sections of the city. Shortly after, Boston was hit by a devastating smallpox epidemic. The importation of new and hard-hitting taxes infuriated the colonists. Not only did these taxes affect the economic well-being of the colonies, in the eyes of the colonists, they were illegal. As Patrick Henry noted in his address to Virginia Assembly in 1765, British law dictates that only Parliament can raise taxes in order that all British citizens, which they were, he represented. Up until 1764, any discussion of taxes on the colonies went through colonial legislatures. This time, however, Parliament bypassed the legislatures and levied the tax on the colonists directly, without representation to speak for them in London. So, this is where the phrase no taxation without representation comes in. The colonists protested these taxes both in an official capacity, offering petitions from state legislatures, and unofficially by attacking local tax collectors. Finally, winning a small victory when Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. However, the ideology behind the tax had not changed. Parliament remained adamant it had the right to tax the colonists without representation in London, and all attempts by colonists to convince them otherwise were rejected. This unlawful taxation, eviction from the Ohio Valley, and the military occupation of the colonies led many American colonists to believe that if Parliament and the King no longer respected their rights as British citizens, perhaps they were better off without Britain altogether. Committees within the colonies formed networks to coordinate protest efforts. While Bostonians tossed tea into the harbor in protest, New York and Philadelphia turned away ships carrying tea, forced them back to Britain. Britain replied to this action by closing Boston Harbor until the taxes were paid. With each action and reaction, relations between Britain and its American colonies deteriorated. Understanding that war was inevitable, colonists formed militias and asked a former British officer from Virginia, George Washington, to lead them. In 1774, the newly formed Continental Congress informed Britain that colonists were no longer bound by the laws of Parliament as long as Parliament denied colonists their basic rights and liberties. They knew it was only a matter of time and that they were already well on their way down the road to revolution. War is definitely coming.